invitations should have gone out to all of you. Apologies for those who haven't received it, and we hope you will receive it in the course of the day. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock we have a small function. We have the inauguration of an exhibition on Gandhiji's last fast. This is the first. It's an exhibition which draws on the collections of the Nehru Memorial Museum. It has photographs, telegrams, news clippings, some fairly rare memorabilia about Gandhiji's last fast leading up to the moment of the tragic assassination. There's a small inauguration by the Minister of Culture at 10 a.m. But the exhibition will stay here for 2 weeks, after which it will continue in the museum. So you're all most welcome. We also mark the occasion, as we did earlier, with a talk at 3 o'clock, a public lecture by D. Geeta, a well-known historian, author, playwright, who's also edited a very fine volume, Gandhiji on Nonviolence. Her subject is Travelling with Nonviolence, 3 Stopovers. Continuing with the public lecture series on the 31st, it is our privilege to welcome Professor Musharraf Hassan, presently at the National Archives of India, distinguished historian, in our series on rethinking history, seeking on the road to freedom, prisons and prisoners under the Raj. The first and second, which is Friday and Saturday, we have a 2-day conference, Frontier India and Northeast, done by Team Murthy in association with our very own senior fellow, Professor Sajid Nag, Dr. Surya Sikha Pathak from Assam University, Silchar, and Professor Gunal Tedalov from Uppsala University, Sweden. On Monday, we continue with our Hindi lecture series, Lulu Roy of the Hazard Center, speaking on Itihas, Samaj और पर्यावरण. And next week, Tuesday, the weekly seminar is Ms. Julia Stephens, Harvard University, Shamsul Nisa's case, Domesticity, Economy and Colonial Secularization. This is on the 5th of February. But it's a privilege to welcome my distinguished colleague, Professor Partha Ghosh, who recently joined as senior fellow at Team Murthy. His work is very widely known, all of you are familiar with it. But for the record, he's been Professor of South Asian Studies at the School of International Studies, JNU. He's held the ICCR Chair on Indian Studies at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. Professor Partha Ghosh has written extensively on a range of subjects. His most recent book was called The Politics of Personal Law in South Asia, Identity, Nationalism and the Uniform Civil Code. The subject for today's lecture is Making Sense of Cross-Border Migrations in South Asia. This lecture is of particular importance to us because since December we've been having a series of public lectures on the relationship of India and the wider world. What I think is especially important about this talk, we'll be privileged to hear it in a few moments, is the ways in which it looks at India in the larger context of the South Asian region where India is located. Without further ado, Professor Partha Ghosh.
Thank you. I find there is a similarity between politicians and academics. They both get excited by seeing the crowd. This crowd is not that exciting, but not too bad either. Having said that, let me introduce the subject with a bit of autobiographical note. I'm a Bengali. I come from Bihar. In my childhood, I often used to get intrigued that how, when I speak Bengali at home, there are other Bengalis in Bhagalpur, town where I lived, they did not speak Bengali. Many of these people had even Bengali surnames, but they didn't speak. On inquiry, I came to know from my father that my family migrated about 150 years ago from a place called Arambagh. Now it is famous for its chicken. Arambagh in Bardhaman district to Bhagalpur after the revolt of 1857, when the local police stations were looking for more people to man those police stations, and he came as a daroga, my great-grandfather, to Bhagalpur. Then I inquired that how about the others who did not speak Bengali at home. Then he explained to me that these guys must have come much earlier, and on inquiry further, I came to know they came to Bhagalpur during the time of Akbar. Whatever be the reason, I do not know. But they came, and since the communication network was much weaker than in the late 19th century, they could not retain their language. Incidentally, they females put on sari the way Bengalis put on, Bengali females, and their marriage customs and everything remained Bengali, except the language. They started speaking the local Bhagalpuri dialect, which is known these days as Angika. This thought remained in my mind in the subsequent years of my life, and I later wrote many small pieces on migration and things like those, till I wrote finally a book called Unwanted and Uprooted, Migrants and Refugees in South Asia. It was 2004. After writing that book, I was convinced of one thing, that I know so little of the subject. When I joined JNU later, I introduced a course for MPhil students to deal with the subject. And there my interactions with the students helped me a lot to develop the idea further. Fortunately for me, after my retirement, I have got this fellowship on which I am working, and I am sure that in another 2 years' time, definitely, I'll produce a much more serious stuff than what I wrote in 2004. This is a bit of an introduction of my interest in the subject. Migration as such, it need not be told to this crowd, that is as old as human history. Right from the day humans existed on earth, people have been moving from place to place. Like birds or like animals, humans also have moved. Boundaries, borders were phenomena which came much, much later. I was reading a few years ago the bestseller, 2007 one of the bestsellers, Nayan Chanda's book, Bound Together. In the preface of the book, there is an interesting story. That in 1953, the science of DNA was discovered. Taking advantage of that knowledge, one of the New York Times columnists, Nicholas Kristof, he wanted to know his ancestry. He consulted a lab to find out his ancestry. It was found that 20,000 generations ago, his forefathers came from somewhere near Somalia or present Ethiopia. An article he wrote after that, the date I have, sometime in 2000, I tell you the exact date, 2003, September. He wrote an article in New York Times saying, the title of it is, I'm a Black American. Is there anything called race? Nicholas Kristof was definitely not a Black American. He was white American with very clear European descent. Still, and that article, that information I found very fascinating. That's why I thought that I must refer it to you. Now, to put the matter in perspective, let me give you a few statistics. Between 1815 and 1914, that means in 100 years' time, 60 million Europeans left Europe for their new abodes. In the Americas, North and South America, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia. 60 million. A bit later, but again in another 100 years' time, about 70 million South Asians either moved within the region, crossing the borders, or they went beyond South Asian region to settle abroad. To break up this 70 million figure, I have found that about 35 million people left their homes within South Asia to look for shelter in another South Asian countries during these last 60 years. And the remaining 25 million people left for other parts of the world, mostly as indentured labor force or as traders and business people. Staggering figures, actually. Our concern today is about these people, these Asians, not the Europeans that I talked about. My concern is not that, except a small footnote I can add that by the late 18th century, the population pressure was so much in England that economist Malthus has virtually predicted the doom for England. And he wrote in his celebrated, I'm forgetting the name of the essay, he wrote in his celebrated essay that how England will be ruined because of population pressure late 18th century. Fortunately, within a couple of decades, things started changing, partly because of Industrial Revolution, partly because of colonial processes that set in. As a result, there were huge migrations from England plus other countries as well. And that probably saved Europe, England in particular. These 35 million people of South Asia that I'm talking about, let us start our story from 1947. There is also an element of diaspora, which I'll be discussing only in passing, because then I'll take too much time to handle the subject. This 35 million people calculation might be questioned by somebody, but by and large my calculation would be correct. Here again a small clarification. When I say South Asia, which is a bit complex theme conceptually, I have done some work to understand how the notion of South Asia came into being. That is another altogether different subject. I would not handle that right now here. At the moment, the simple definition of South Asia is the eight countries that constitute SAARC. Till recently, Afghanistan was not part of SAARC, but now it is part of SAARC. Therefore, we have 8 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Pakistan, and something you might remember. Okay, these are the 8 countries. But in my discussion, it is necessary to bring in Myanmar also, because Myanmar was part of the British Indian Empire till 1937. And because of historic and social reasons, Myanmar has a close connection with India in particular and other parts of South Asia as well. For my purpose again, I would exclude from this definition Maldives. But Maldives is one country which does not figure in the type of things that I'd be talking about. First of all, it is a very small country and their local laws do not allow anybody to get settled there. It's a 100% Sunni country and any non-Sunni is not allowed to settle there, leave alone any other religion. Even a Maldivian, if he goes out and gets married to any other religion, including a Shia, he or she is not allowed to come back unless the spouse is converted into Sunnism. In short, Maldives doesn't figure in the type of discussion that we are having. To make things simpler, I have decided to divide these 35 million people into categories for our easy understanding of the subject. Again, methodologically, these categorizations that I have done might be questioned. I myself have questioned it, but I am using it for the purposes of clarity for the time being. The categories are, first of all, I just run through the categories, then I'll come to the explanation and how many are involved in each category. First is the partition of India, that is one category, and the resultant migrations. Second is failure in nation building. Third, inter-ethnic conflict. 4, open or virtually open borders. 5, developmental and environmental refugees. 6, statelessness. 7, interventions by extra-regional powers. Those powers which are not part of the region that I just now defined. Here I mean the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and the Chinese attack on India in 1962. These are the two extra-regional interventions in the region. Coming to the first, that is partition of India in 1947. This is the most, any literature on migration and refugees, mostly the subject that occupies the largest chunk of the discussion is this, the partition. Even now, every day a new book is coming on partition, on refugee, on memories and things like those. Therefore, on the one hand, it is very easy to find out the resource material on this field, yet at the same time, since every day new research is coming, new ideas are being thrown up, it is also at the same time most challenging. I'll quickly mention about it that we all know that because of the Hindu-Muslim cleavage that had been being built up, the riots, one after another riots that preceded the division of the continent and also continued beyond that, led to millions of Hindus leaving the present Bangladesh and Pakistan and come to India, and many equal number of Muslims who left India for Pakistan. The process did not end in 1947. It continued for years, at least in large quantum. It continued till 1951. By 1951, 20 million people had crossed borders. India, Pakistan, those days there's no Bangladesh. India, Pakistan borders, 20 million. Almost in equal number. Here, a small reference to the partition process is important. That is the job that was done by Cyril Radcliffe, we all know. And we all should also know that Radcliffe didn't have any knowledge of India. He was a lawyer. He was chosen to demarcate the borders between India, or form the borders between India and Pakistan, having no knowledge of India, prior knowledge of India. He was given only 5 weeks' time to do the job with rudimentary maps and totally undependable census data. You can imagine what could he have accomplished. It was bound to be a mess. Unfortunately, it was his job to do this mess. Being an intelligent man, he was quite aware of the mess that he had created. In Sunil Khilnani's book, there is a letter which he has quoted of Radcliffe writing to his stepson, just a day before he flew back to England. And the content of the letter says that I sweated and sweated to do this job. I'm just paraphrasing it. I know I have done a mess of it, and I also know that if the people find me, they'll lynch me. Therefore, I do not want to make myself available to them. And he quietly leaves India, and before he left India, he saw to it that all his rough notes and resource materials were all burnt. Posterity is not left with any information how did he arrive at XYZ details of the border making. I have sympathies for him because he could not have done this job better, and he was chosen particularly for the reason that he was unaware of India. They thought that he could be objective, and this had the nod of both Congress Party and the Muslim League. This I wanted to underline. It was not purely a British maneuvering that you can talk about. All three approved of this selection of Radcliffe as the border maker. This resulted in huge dislocation of people, and we have many movies we have seen to that effect. Many books have been written on the experiences of this border and the crisis that it led to. There are two sectors. One was West Punjab, where one was Western India, another was Eastern India. East Pakistan was created, the present Bangladesh that is, and in the West, Punjab and other provinces of present Punjab, present Pakistan were the so-called West Pakistan. A large number of Muslims, here I wanted to underline one thing, that a large number of Muslims who went from Bihar, UP, Hyderabad and other places, they generally went to Sindh because Sindh was less populated and Karachi was the capital, more attractive destination. Majority of them went there. So far, the East Punjabis were concerned, East Punjabi Muslims are concerned, they went to only Punjab part of it. And West Punjab saw to it that it did not accept anybody other than the Punjabi Muslims. And this dichotomy, which we'll discuss a bit later, came in the future politics of Pakistan. But this is to be underlined that a segment or a couple of segments of Muslims from India went to Sindh, and the Punjabi Muslims went to Punjab part of it. Punjab remained therefore homogeneous, but Sindh could not remain homogeneous. There were Sindhis, now they had the so-called Muhajirin. We who write in English have a tendency to put Muhajir in the plural as Muhajirs. But recently when I read Mushir Hassan's book, then I found it is wrong to say Muhajirs is Muhajirin. Plural of Muhajir is Muhajirin. Recently a Pakistani friend of mine corrected that in India he finds that when they say masla in plural, we say masle, the issues, but it is wrong, it is missile. Masla's plural is missile, which is a different meaning altogether, but anyway, and he corrected that you should not say masle, it is missile. Anyway, that's just off the track. We'll come to this again later in my lecture, this dichotomy. So far the Hindus were concerned, from West Punjab, the Hindus and Sikhs mostly came to, naturally, North India, Delhi and Haryana. Those days there was no Haryana, Punjab. Even Himachal Pradesh was part of Punjab at that time. So far, the Bengali Hindus were concerned from East Pakistan or East Bengal. They came mostly to West Bengal, but also to Assam, Tripura and other places. By and large, this was the division, how it worked out. Coming to the second point of my category, second category so to say, failure the second category, failure in nation building. In this category, I have a couple of examples. The biggest example is that of Pakistan itself. It was created in the name of Islam and on the basis of two-nation theory. But within a few years, rather in the first decade itself, to be more precise, in 1952 itself, within 5 years of the creation of Pakistan, it was clear that Urdu could not be imposed as the national language of Pakistan. East Bengal was, in terms of number of people, was bigger than all the 4 provinces of West Pakistan put together. Here it was interesting that Urdu was not the language of any of the 5 provinces of Pakistan. I mean Sindh, Northwest Frontier Province, now it is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, renamed. Okay, Sindh, Northeast Western Frontier Province, Punjab and Balochistan and East Bengal. Urdu was not the language of anybody. It was the language of the migrant community from India, which had gone from North India in particular, other parts as well. Yet, because these were in the forefront of the Muslim League movement for Pakistan, therefore it was introduced as the national language of Pakistan. Since other provinces of Pakistan, other West Pakistani provinces, their languages were not so much attached to their language at that time. Now Punjabis are more attached than it was at that time. They did not protest against this. But Bengalis were very proud of their language. Rather, I would say Bengali ethnicity centers around language, not religion. Since Bengalis were kind of given the backseat in this process, there were protests in Bengal, and right in the first decade itself of 52, there is a huge protest movement in in East Bengal for making against Urdu, not making Bengali the language, but against Urdu. If you go to Dhaka now and you go to their museum, National Museum, and there is a section on Bangladesh's national movement. And the section does not start from 1970 that we would expect. The section starts from 1952, Bhasha Andolan, the language movement. They trace their origin of national movement of Bangladesh from 1952. What I am trying to emphasize that this was the root cause of the division in the Pakistani society between the Bengali speaking people and Urdu and other speakers of other languages. This is the first dichotomy, and I'm not going into details of the story. Then it culminated in a process that by 1970 they reached a stage where they found that there is no going backward. Now they have to have an independent nation, whatever the name. And that led to Bangladesh, creation of Bangladesh. In the creation of Bangladesh, one of the factors that contributed, I would say most, was the Indian support for the cause of the Bangladeshi rebels for independence. 10 million people from Bangladesh, 10 million people from East Bengal came to India as refugees. Given the inimical relationship between India and Pakistan, India did not want to leave any stone unturned to take advantage of the situation. Of course, it was a humanitarian problem. India was totally concerned about that. We all know I joined JNU that year only, 1971, when Bangladesh situation was hotting up. And I know how many demonstrations I participated in just in front of this building, in Murti Bhavan. My photo also came in the newspaper. I was very excited next day. Not that there was no humanitarian concern, but there is also a diplomatic interest to be served. And Mrs. Gandhi made a tour of various capitals of the world and tried to advertise that a poor country like India cannot sustain the cost of maintaining 10 million refugees. Although this did not impress neither Nixon nor Kissinger, but she could talk over the heads of these people to American people. As a result, a public opinion was created in favor of India against Pakistan, in favor of Bangladesh. Anyway, I'm not again going into the war. War took place. It was a short war of 2 weeks, and it was a decisive victory. I would say that's the only decisive victory so far India has been able to accomplish, and it was a defeat for Pakistan, and Bangladesh was created. My story is not about that. My story is about 10 million refugees had come to India. And here, the refugee issue, you can see, it has a humanitarian dimension, it has a political dimension, it has a diplomatic dimension. Then another case in the same category of failure of nation building, just small cases. Like Nepalis of southern Bhutan taking shelter in Nepal as refugees. Because towards the end of 1980s and early 1990s, there was something called Triklam Namza, which was introduced in Bhutan. The policy was to Bhutanize the Nepali politics, Bhutanize Bhutanese politics, in the sense that you have to put on a particular type of dress to enter into any sarkari body, any government office or parliament or whatever. You have even the schools, government-run schools. You have to put on a particular dress. You have to accept Zonkha as the national language. This disadvantaged about 25% people of Nepal. I'm giving a conservative estimate. Nepalis claim that the number was much more. But anyway, they were in southern Bhutan. Ultimately, as it always happens in such situation, there was a state of insurgency in southern Bhutan, leading to repression by the Bhutanese state, leading to about 100,000 people of southern Bhutan leaving for Nepal and India. Here a small interesting point I must refer to, that if you look at the map, Nepal does not touch Bhutan. In between there is Indian territory. It's intriguing that why these 100,000 Nepalis did not come to India. All these areas are Nepali populated. Darjeeling, Kalimpong, all these areas, Sikkim, Yet they decided to go to Nepal. I would suspect, I do not have hard data to prove, I would suspect that it was India's cleverness not to allow them to come take shelter in India, unnecessarily will complicate our relationship, wonderful, friendly relationship with Bhutan. If not for anything else, we are at least ensured of one Pakka vote in the General Assembly every year, And India and Bhutan are the one can think of the best of relationships all these years. And India saw to it that these people go to Nepal. It will help Bhutan in a way because Nepal cannot handle Bhutan. And that too behind Bhutan was India in shining armor. This is my suspicion. I cannot provide you hard data. As a student of international politics, as a student of India's foreign policy, I can think that it must have happened. Must have happened. Therefore, I'm very conscious of my time. I'm rather running very slow. You may not be coming in the way, but gradually the crowd will be thinning down. Sorry. This is my experience as a teacher. Okay. In the same category, that is failure in nation building, is the case of Myanmar. Not going into the complications of Myanmar politics, where the Myanmari leadership introduced Buddhism as the state religion, right from the time of U Nu, continued during Ne Win's time. In any case, situation became so bad for the settled Muslims in certain areas, Arakan areas, the so-called Rohingyas you often see in the newspaper, that many Rohingyas took shelter in Bangladesh. Even today, the relationship between Bangladesh and Myanmar is quite often complicated by this one issue of what to do with the Rohingyas, how they can be repatriated back to Burma, that is Myanmar, because they are in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and quite a large number, about 250,000 Rohingyas in Bangladesh. Then there are small categories like Chin Burmese refugees, about 50,000 in Mizoram. Because of the situation in Myanmar, many of the dissident groups who are not accepted by the military junta of Burma, they have taken shelter in Mizoram. I'm running through quickly. The third category is the inter-ethnic conflict. Here I am particularly referring to the Sinhala-Tamil conflict. Sinhala-Tamil conflict started almost at the same time when Sri Lanka became independent, when the nationality question came into being, citizenship. It started with the Indian Tamils, but then because of other policies like Sinhala only and giving Buddhism the pride of place in Sri Lankan politics, that after 1956 onwards we see a deteriorating relationship between the Tamils, Sri Lanka Tamils, and the majority Sinhalas. In any such situation, inevitably after some time insurgency picks up. This is a long story how insurgency picked up in Sri Lanka, which you all know that ultimately came to be headed by the Tamil Tigers, and recently the Tamil Tigers are defeated by the Sri Lankan state. But these things led to a huge anti-Tamil riots of 1983. That is in one way the watershed. After that there is no going back. And riots have taken place in Sri Lanka before that also. Riots have taken place in India also in large number. We should not blame Sri Lanka for that matter. We have enough in our plate. So the riots are concerned. But the 1983 riot was different in the sense it was for the first time that the middle class was also targeted. Generally you see any riot anywhere, the underdogs get killed. They are dislocated. Except, again, we have seen it in 1984 when middle class Sikhs were also attacked. But in Sri Lanka 1983, Sri Lanka Tamil middle class was also affected by this riot. This led to about, again, 100,000 Sri Lankan Tamils taking shelter in India. This is a huge, huge number. For a small state like 100,000 is not a big number. But for a state like Sri Lanka, it's a big number. It is not a very populated country. It was a big number, and that too, since they came and settled, took shelter in Tamil Nadu, it had huge ripples in the Tamil politics, Tamil Nadu politics, because of ethnic connection. Open and virtually open borders. The next category I have identified. Why I have called virtually open? We know we have open borders with India, between India and Nepal. We are treaty bound to keep our borders open. But there are borders where we are not treaty bound to keep them open, but they are open. Like India-Bangladesh border, India-Bhutan border, and India-Myanmar border. None of them is officially open, but effectively they are all open, resulting in again a huge number of people coming and going both ways. In Nepal, the number is staggering. They come in millions, maybe in crores also sometimes. Nepal is coming to India and settling down, and Indians going to Nepal and settling down. We have a huge India problem in Nepal because of that. We know about the Madhesis the Madhesis of Nepal. It's a huge number. And Nepalis always feel that the situation may come one day that they will be outnumbered by the Hindi-speaking people of Nepal. It would not happen the other way around, because India is too big to be overwhelmed by the Nepalis here, but there are pockets of Nepali-dominated areas in India where politics is highly dependent on the Nepali ethnicity. Even now there is a case of Gurkha land as a state, bifurcating West Bengal, present West Bengal. That's a reality again. More interesting is the porous borders, the so-called virtually open borders. Bhutan border is virtually open. If you go to Phuntsholing, the commercial hub like Bhutan's Mumbai, I would say, then their business is virtually controlled by Indians, and Indians can go and come back, and the border checkpost starts from the edge of Phuntsholing to the rest of Bhutan. Border checkpost is not there between Phuntsholing and India. Beyond Phuntsholing, the so-called border checkpost is there, whatever it means. I'm talking about Indians. Foreigners is a different case altogether. Okay? Myanmar. On map, we find borders are nicely demarcated, and we think they're very important. You go to the border area, then you will understand how unimportant and useless those borders are. Some time ago, I went to a district called Saiha in Mizoram, which touches the borders of Myanmar. First of all, with plain eyes, you cannot make out where India ends and where Myanmar begins. It was a Christmas time, and the markets were so full of people. I could not imagine that Saiha as a district could have so many people shopping there. I came to know that 50% of the crowd is coming from Myanmar, because Myanmar, that adjacent area of Myanmar is also Christian area. If they have to go for shopping in their own country, they have to drive 40 kilometers. Same areas of Myanmar, if they come to Saiha, is only 8 kilometers. It makes sense for them to come. It makes sense for the Mizo businessmen to sell their ware to the Myanmari Christians. As a result, these borders do not exist really. Therefore, cross-border migrations are so rampant. It's very difficult to keep track of who is a Myanmari and who is a Mizo in those areas. Ethnically, they're same. They speak the same language, the same religion. Coming to the developmental issues, I would say that, let me quickly say that we have one example, that is of Chakma refugees. The Kaptai Dam, which was created in East Pakistan those days, in the 60s, resulted in inundation of land, which you are all familiar with. Every day is happening in India. Inundation of land and destabilizing the local Chakmas, Marmas and such tribal groups, and they took shelter in India. A large number of them are still in India. Again, about 100,000 are still in India. They are in Arunachal Pradesh, and that is a huge political issue. Because Arunachal students' unions would not allow them to cast their votes. Even after the fact that Supreme Court has given the verdict in their favor. They are full-fledged Indian nationals now, therefore they should be given opportunity to cast their votes in Indian elections. But because of the pressure from the Arunachal students' unions, there were several, and it is not possible at all. It has not been possible at all. Now coming to the sixth point, that is statelessness. This exactly is not a migrant issue. But if, yes, I understand. Ultimately, you have to. Okay, I'll be very quick, very fast. Okay? I always am familiar with this subject. It's too vast a subject. Anyway, statelessness. Here I have several categories. I'll just refer to one interesting part, that is the enclaves. India and Bangladesh have several pockets which are in other countries, yet they belong to your sovereignty. And it is interesting how it happened. It happened because of the decision, again Ratcliffe did the mistake, he didn't know, that Rangpur and Kuch Bihar, there are two zamindaris. That Kuch Bihar was to remain in India and Rangpur to go to Bangladesh, to Pakistan. Now in Kuch Bihar, there were very many small pockets of Rangpur zamindari. How it happened, it is an interesting story again, but there is no time for that. It's a jua. These two zamindars are playing all kinds of, what is jua? They are gamble, and they used to offer, okay, if I lose, you get that village. If I lose, I get that village. Like that, And in the process took place, and now it's a mess. Interventions. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, leading to 3.5 million Pathans taking shelter in Pakistan. Large number have gone back, large number have come back also. It's a continuous process because of the instability in the region. So far, China is concerned, in our part, our country, much before the 1962 war between India and China, the relations started worsening between the two countries, resulting in Tibetans coming to India and taking shelter. Even now, there are about 70,000 odd or 90,000 odd Tibetans in Dharamshala. This is one. What we do not know, I came to know through my research only, that many Chinese who have settled in India for generations, if not for centuries, they were heckled by the Indian state. I felt very sad to read about this, because I think it is done by everybody, every other country, not by India, But Indians were very nasty so far, these Chinese, particularly in Calcutta, Chinatown. They were heckled, and some of them were evicted from Calcutta. They had nowhere to go. They didn't want to go back to China. They have taken shelter in Rajasthan. quickly ask, only 3 minutes left. Okay? It is not only figures that I'm talking about, politics. Here, to give you an example, Muhajirs went from India to Pakistan, and they were the carriers of the two-nation theory that carried with them. Pakistani foreign policy and politics was completely dominated by this community for at least for the first 10 years. The India-Pakistan relationship as it is now had its origin in this unsimple development. Then the BJP's rise in India is also largely attributable to the fact that Punjabis, refugees who were very sore about their experience in Punjab, they came and settled in India, and Bharatiya Jansangh's nucleus was Delhi to start with. When Shama Prasad Mukherjee started it, he has gone on record to say this thing. Security also has a huge connection. There is a huge debate here. I would not go into that. The fact remains that you do not forget that 6 of the accused people in Rajiv Gandhi assassination case were registered refugees in Tamil Nadu. 6 of them, Sri Lanka Tamil refugees, were registered refugees. Yet they took part in the assassination scheme to kill Rajiv Gandhi. 2 little points. One is legal aspect. South, there are 2 basic documents on which the refugee regimes have been constructed upon. One is 1951 Refugee Convention, another is 1967 Protocol, Refugee Protocol. These are the basic documents. None of the South Asian states, none of the 8 South Asian states has signed either of these documents. The logic is that those documents were created under particular circumstances, keeping in view particular interests of a region or specific countries. India and its neighbors do not fall in that category of understanding. Therefore, all kinds of things are happening now to work out a common code for refugees, but it has not been done yet. Last but not the least, the last point I'm making, it's not only the humans who migrate, it's not only that politics which gets influenced, it is not only that security gets influenced, it's a huge cultural dimension to it. That along with humans, their cultures also migrate. And when those cultures intermingle with the cultures of the host country, inevitably something hybrid emerges. The best example is that of black slaves in America. The Kentucky Fried Chicken that you know now so much, Kentucky Fried Chicken, frying was unknown to the Americans. That is what I've read. It is the blacks who brought this frying in their cuisine. And now Kentucky Fried Chicken is a marker, American identity marker. Of course, after having traveled to India, Kentucky Fried Chicken has started masala fried chicken now, because they have understood it doesn't work in India. Bland fried chicken. Bhojpuri music and calypso, the way they have interacted with each other, and Tejaswini Nilanjana's book on those things, and Jahaji music documentary that has been prepared by Surabhi Sharma, they all talk about this fusion of music. I end here because the story can go on and go on. I'm so sorry that I took more time than I should have, but I get carried away. Thank you very much.